Laurie has been in the press gallery, was in the press gallery for close to 50 years, but we in Melbourne like to think this city is his spiritual home. Laurie began at the Daily Mirror in Sydney, but in 1967 he was poached to Melbourne by the equally legendary Harry Gordon to work on the Sun News Pictorial. And I'd like to acknowledge Harry's son, Michael Gordon, here is in the audience as well, next to Laurie. And before too long, he was, at the age of 25, the Sun News Pictorial's bureau chief in Canberra. And as Lane explained, we all saw what happened after that. In his time in the gallery, Laurie covered 13 prime ministers, covered 30 elections, and, wait for it, 51 budgets. And he's still relatively sane. In 1980, as Lane mentioned, he famously got hold of John Howard's budget. He has broken stories about leadership deals at Kirribilli House, illicit affairs in Parliament House, and ministers' travel routes. When he announced his retirement in early August, everybody was taken by surprise, and there were lots of tributes from the great and the good, the Prime Minister, the opposition leader, senior ministers, senior Labor figures. But there was one tribute that struck home with me, and it was from Lane Calcutt, who wrote an online piece on the Nine News website, where he wrote about the Laurie the public knows and respects, and the Laurie the politicians fear, the tough, scary, at times intimidating political editor. But Lane went on to write about the private Laurie, and in Lane's words, he's an extraordinarily gentle, compassionate and caring man for whom no problem in that bureau was too big or too small. And anybody who has met Laurie, the private Laurie, would absolutely echo those sentiments. Laurie has agreed to speak and also take your questions at the end, so please put your thinking caps on. But it's my great honour and great privilege to welcome to the Melbourne Press Club, Laurie Oakes.
Well, this is pretty overwhelming for me, I have to say, and I'm terribly grateful. Thank you for those kind words. Michael, I'll thank Lane personally when I see him next week. But I want to thank you all for coming, and to thank the Melbourne Press Club for organising this lunch. Although I'm based in Canberra, I've long felt a strong link with the Melbourne Press Club, and I've been involved with its activities whenever I could. Including a period as one of the Perkin Award judges. And many members of this club are people that I've worked with over the years. Some of them work with me in the Sunpick Gallery in Canberra. I notice David Broadbent, for example, is here. We had a terrific staff in those days, and I don't think any bureau since, except maybe the Nine bureau, has gotten close. When I picked up the papers this morning, my first thought was, God, I'm so old I knew Lionel Murphy. In fact, I broke the story about his terminal cancer that shut down that inquiry. But making me feel even older was the fact that I'd even had a bit to do with Abe Saffron, known to the headline writers, of course, as Mr. Sin. That was in my brief period on police rounds at the Mirror. Not long after I joined the Mirror, knowing nothing, straight out of university, having to be trained from scratch, a young journo called Anna Torv was given the job of showing me something about court reporting. And the case involved theft charges against Mr. Saffron on the flimsy grounds, as I recall, that every room in Lodge 44, the Sydney motel he owned, that was also his headquarters, contained a stolen refrigerator. Naturally, he got off. At one stage during the trial, a cauliflower-eared thug leaned across me to hand a note to Anna, which I intercepted. And it was from Abe saying he'd like to meet her after the hearing that day. Well, I don't think Anna had much trouble deciding against it, and of course she later married Rupert Murdoch. I remember Lionel Murphy's appointment to the High Court. Gough Whitlam and co wanted to get rid of him, and that was the reason it was offered. But Lionel couldn't make up his mind whether he'd take it or not. It was one of the dramas at the famous ALP National Conference at the Florida Hotel at Terrigal on the New South Wales Central Coast at the end of '75. Sorry, the beginning of '75. Gough had just got back from the longest prime ministerial junket in history, a tour of just about every ancient ruin in Europe, interrupted briefly for a quick dash home to look at some new ruins in Darwin after Cyclone Tracy. The ACTU President Bob Hawke seemed to spend the entire time at the conference wearing nothing but Speedos and having sunblock rubbed into him by a procession of nubile young women in bikinis. At one stage, Hawke was photographed and filmed being whipped by a young Labor staffer of the female persuasion, wearing not much more than he was at old Sydney Town. Deputy PM Jim Cairns, for some reason, decided that was the occasion to lift the lid on his affair with Jeannie Morosi. He declared to a Sydney journalist he had a kind of love for Jeannie, and cleverly he chose to deliver this news to a journalist who was the wife of a Liberal MP. A lot of thought went into it, obviously. Jim and Jeannie were, from then on, chased all around the Florida Hotel in Terrigal by photographers. The Resources Minister Rex Connor was holed up in his room at the hotel, pacing up and down waiting for a telex message from a shadowy Pakistani commodities dealer, Tirith Kamlani, which Rex, the strangler Connor, hoped would confirm that $4 billion in shonky petrodollar loans was on its way for massive pipelines and other grand projects he dreamed of in Northern Australia. Well, the telex never came, nor did the money, and the strangler lost his job. And Lionel Murphy was playing hard to get over the High Court. And one minute he'd agree, then he'd change his mind. One senior legal figure was actually told on a Friday that he was the next High Court judge. But on Monday they broke the bad news to him that the deal was off and Lionel was going to take it after all. So all these dramas were happening simultaneously in one location. Somebody should make a film about it, talk about the good old days. But back to the lunch. I was saying that this farewell means a lot to me, and that's partly because, from my standpoint, it's also about farewelling the craft that I love and the place where my career as a political journalist got liftoff. I'd been a state political reporter in Sydney for a couple of years before moving to Melbourne, but it was the decision of the late great Harry Gordon, editor of what was then the Sun News Pictorial, to put me in charge of the Canberra bureau at the tender age, as Michael said, of 25, that really set the direction of my life. I applied for a Canberra posting and I thought I had a chance of being number 2. And when I found myself in charge of the Canberra bureau of the biggest selling newspaper in the country and head of the whole Herald Weekly chain, you know, I was absolutely overwhelmed. I didn't think I was up to it, nor did anybody else except Harry. God knows what he'd been smoking, but I've always been very grateful to him. When I tried in my 2011 Andrew Olley lecture to describe how I feel about what I do, or rather what I did, I co-opted a phrase that I'd seen in an article about an American journalist, joie de journalism. It always sounds more impressive in French, I think. And the same phrase was used 3 years later when the famous Washington Post editor Ben Bradley of Watergate fame died. Ben, it was said in one obituary, oozed joie de journalism from every pore. Well, I've had more than half a century of oozing that kind of joy. Journalism is a public service. It lubricates our democracy. It helps keep the bastards honest. It imposes great responsibility on the people who practice it. It's important. It matters. But it's also fun. It's an adventure. It gets the adrenaline going. There's nothing like the buzz you feel when you get a big scoop. Political journalism in particular deals with intrigue, great drama, fascinating characters. Dan Rather compared journalism with cocaine and with crack cocaine, and he's right. But politics is also addictive, and so when I retired, I thought going cold turkey might be pretty difficult. Surprisingly, so far, though, there are no regrets. It's been pretty easy. And the only time I was tempted to reach for the laptop was when I read a story the other day about Malcolm Turnbull delivering a gobful of obscenity-laden abuse at Tony Abbott on a VIP flight 3 years ago. It wasn't the exposure of the incident itself that interested me, but the claim from a member of the Turnbull media team that the PM does not use that kind of language. I'll tell you what, it'll be a while before I lose the urge to respond to porkies like that. I haven't got anything very deep to say today. I thought I'd have a grumble, a bit of a ramble, and then indulge in some nostalgia, because that's what old pensioners do. It was suggested I might talk about some of the highlights of my career, but two other stories caught my attention since my retirement, and they brought back memories of a low point. One was the yarn about Tony Abbott missing key parliamentary divisions in 2009 because he was so drunk that no one could rouse him to go in to vote. And the other story was the election of Philip Ruddock last weekend to the post of Mayor of Hornsby in New South Wales. They took me back to 1981 and the episode in which I was found to be in contempt of Parliament. The reason, I had the temerity to suggest that there were drunks and bludgers among the members. Most people have forgotten it, but I never will. It was actually a column I wrote where I was trying to be helpful, suggesting that MPs would be less likely to sit around feeling frustrated and drinking if they were given more meaningful work to do through a revamped committee system. And by the way, the committee system has since been revamped and places much more sober and hard-working. But Philip Ruddock, then a backbencher, who was secretary of the newly formed parliamentary group of Amnesty International at the time, and therefore in theory an advocate of free speech and freedom of the press, he got up in the House, uttered the risible line that Parliament was, quote, the most sober working place anywhere in this country, and he moved for an inquiry by the Privileges Committee into my outrageous assertions. And Speaker Billy Snedden, quoting ancient Westminster precedents that allegations of drunkenness were a gross libel on the House, ruled that there was a prima facie case, and members agreed to the inquiry by a vote, 75 votes to 27. It might have been funny to some people, but it certainly wasn't funny to me at the time. I was a freelancer, writing newspaper columns, producing a newsletter, covering Canberra for a radio network, and 10 News, but a freelancer nevertheless. And if they'd taken away my parliamentary pass, which was on the cards and discussed, I'd have lost my livelihood. And the Privileges Committee operated as a star chamber. Proceedings were held in secret, no legal representation was involved. The Mirror editor, Peter Wiley, hauled before it for running the offending column, was asked if he'd be prepared to publish an expression of regret. But when he said he'd need to consult his superiors, he got a sharp warning from a committee member that, quote, he cannot tell anybody anything legal, he cannot tell anybody, including legal advisors, what he was asked or what he said. This is Australian democracy, 1981 style. Fortunately, I had the backing of a few principled MPs, including John Spender, who'd been a prominent lawyer before entering Parliament. I also retained Malcolm Turnbull's father-in-law, Tom Hughes QC, who was a former Attorney-General and the most feared member of the Sydney Bar. And there was a backlash with the result that the forces of darkness got cold feet. I was found to be in contempt of Parliament, but was only thrashed with a feather. By then, of course, I did hold the Parliament in contempt. It took me quite a while to get over the collective display of hypocrisy and thuggery and abuse of democratic principles by MPs. For several years I kept pinned to the wall above my desk a list of the 75 MPs who'd voted with Ruddock. And my contempt for Ruddock himself has never waned. Now, some good did come out of the affair. John Spender headed a joint committee that modernised the concept of privilege. As a result, journalists can now report some things like the Abbott binge without facing contempt charges. It might not have been an earth-shattering event, but the message for me was that it doesn't take much to push our elected representatives into authoritarian behaviour, especially if their own interests are involved. It was a personal experience that reinforced for me that you can't trust these people to do the right thing. You've got to watch them. The media has to watch them. And that's still the case. And the job is getting harder thanks to the impact of digital technology. I happen to think that political journalism is standing up to the digital battering pretty well. I mean, you walk into some offices in the press gallery and the thinning ranks are obvious. But the quality of the reporting of politics is still, I think, very high, as high as it's ever been, maybe. And this is partly because news organisations have cut back in areas where the effects are least noticeable, the old system of rounds where journalists developed areas of specialisation and tapped into the bureaucracy is pretty much gone. That suits the politicians, of course. They don't want journos talking to bureaucrats. But the main reason we're still getting quality political reporting and investigative journalism, despite the cost-cutting and job-shedding, I think, was summed up by Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame a few years ago. The instinct of reporters, he said, is to report. Now, the job's been made harder, but good journalists go the extra mile to get it done, and that's what's happening now. So here's where I have my little ramble. I want to air a few random thoughts on what's happening with the media. It's probably my last chance. One of the results of the digital revolution is that people now have torrents of information coming at them from all directions. It makes it increasingly difficult to tell what's news, what's personal opinion, what's rumour or gossip, and what's fake. And this, of course, makes nonsense of any ideas of journalists as gatekeepers. So what is our role? I like the answer that BuzzFeed's editor-in-chief Ben Smith gave to David Axelrod in a recent podcast. We see our role not as a gatekeeper, Smith said, but as a guide helping to navigate through that polluted mess. So how's that for journalism's new mission statement, guiding punters through the polluted information mess? I think that's where we are, or where we're headed. I see worrying signs, though, that we're not doing it as well as we might, or as well as we should. The case in point was the fuss over the photograph of the Prime Minister at the footy nursing his baby granddaughter while sipping beer from a plastic cup. A few loonies criticised him on social media as irresponsible. And that should have been that, except that the mainstream media chose to treat the whole thing as news, with headlines about the social media backlash against the PM. It's not the first such episode. The kind of dopey or offensive or dangerous comments that you used to hear on a bad night at the pub now get on Facebook or Twitter, and that's bad enough, but then too often mainstream media organisations jump in and amplify the controversy. I happen to think that allowing Twitter trolls to have a role in setting the news agenda is not what we should be about, and we shouldn't be comfortable with it. Another matter of concern, while I'm getting things off my chest, in my view, one of the most important effects of the digital revolution is the change it's bringing about in the power balance between politicians and the media. Basically, politicians are coming to the view, and I'm not sure they're all that wrong, that they don't need the media anymore. Increasingly, they can operate without us. We know Donald Trump's view of the media. He takes that view because he believes he can, because he believes he can reach voters without the media. More than that, he believes, with a fair bit of justification, attacking the media is actually a plus with punters. I know that India's Prime Minister Modi doesn't hold news conferences or have much at all in the way of dealings with journalists. And Malcolm Turnbull's articulated his feelings pretty clearly in several speeches before becoming Prime Minister. The megaphone provided by social media, he said in 2013, means that politicians do not have to suck up to an editor or a producer to get our views into the public domain. The less politicians need the media, the less ability it has to carry out its watchdog role. So it's not just the loss of revenue and the weakening and fragmentation of news organisations that's the worry. When it comes to the impact of digital technology on political journalism, there's also a growing threat of irrelevance, or at least greatly reduced relevance. Well, that's the ramble, so finally the nostalgia. And what could be more nostalgic than talking about Paul Keating? When I was cleaning out my office in the 9 Bureau in Parliament House a couple of weeks ago, I found notes I'd made of one of his phone calls when he was Treasurer. I've written a little bit about it before, but never really thought carefully about what he'd said. When Paul was annoyed with a journalist, which is pretty often, he'd ring up and let fly as only he could. But after a while, the abuse had died down and he'd start to talk about what was going on, what he was doing and what he was thinking about stuff and the rationale behind it. And the thing was, you'd always learn. You'd learn a lot, and I never resented those phone calls. I valued them. And once or twice I made what was close to a verbatim record. But as I reread these notes the other day, a call from Keating 2 days before his notorious, supposedly off the record Placido Domingo speech at the December 1990 Press Gallery dinner, I realised that much of what he'd said was about how to do politics, just simple stuff about the trade. And I thought, what a pity Paul doesn't make one of those calls to Malcolm Turnbull. One of Malcolm's problems was summed up by Benjamin Disraeli a century and a half ago. The world, Disraeli said, is weary of statesmen whom democracy has degraded into politicians. Well, the necessities of politics have prevented Malcolm from being the man we thought he was, and the man he thought he was. But the current PM's main problem, in my view, is that he just isn't very good at politics, never has been. He lacks the skills, and he's not Robinson Crusoe. Political skills, I think, have been in short supply in the post-Howard era, and in all parties. The recent generation of pollies could do well, I think, with a how-to lecture from Paul Keating. This particular call was provoked by a column I'd written saying Labor strategists were appalled at the insensitivity and political stupidity of Keating's "this is the recession we had to have" statement the previous week. When the familiar voice said over the phone, "You just want to be a bleep," and "Laurie, mate, I can spot a bit of bleepery in a fucking fog 3 miles away," I knew I was in trouble. But gradually it developed into a political masterclass. There was a preview of the gallery dinner speech in comments on then opposition leader John Hewson. "I'm a Placido Domingo," Keating said. "What the fuck is he?" meaning Hewson. "He's an usher. This is the grand stage for the grand performances, and this bloke is just an usher." Now, it's a bit rough on Hewson, but the idea of politics as theatre is important. Gough Whitlam knew the theatrical element was essential, so did Peter Costello. But where are the contemporary politicians with the smarts or the talent to bring theatrical skills back to the political stage? At another point, Keating told me, "I regard politics as a form of high art." But he wasn't talking theatre now, he was talking about the art of political judgment. A judgment on how to handle something like the recession issue, he said, could not be made by a staffer, a pollster, or a poll reader. Only a specialist in the art form, a politician, could do it. And to develop the necessary political artistry, Keating said, took a good 20 years. Now, put aside the innate Keating arrogance, he's right. Political judgment is something you learn, and it's in short supply also these days, especially on the coalition side. Malcolm Turnbull, with previous careers as journalist, lawyer and merchant banker, certainly hasn't spent 20 years developing the art, and doesn't it show? There are a few other lessons in politics, or at least the Keating approach to politics from the phone call. Don't talk down to the public. That, according to Keating, is the greatest mistake many politicians make. "I always talk up to them," he said. "I always try and tell them what the problem is. I try and explain the stuff." And related to that, tell it like it is. He said they get up in the morning and see there's a recession. Keating says it's a recession they had to have. The people who don't like me say, "The bastard," but he's probably right. And the nice ones say, "You've told us the bloody truth and good on you." All this involves courage. And Keating said, "I'm in the crazy brave category. You've got to stand up for what you believe." Another point, he said, "I'm prepared to chance my hand and take the whole show to the wire." And again, we've got to break the fucking inflation rate. It's not going to be done with some namby-pamby bleep trying not to have a recession that you should have. Well, there's a bit of a contrast between the politicians we're used to now, isn't there? I can understand today's pollies shying away from the crazy bit, but a bit of bravery, I think it'd be nice occasionally. And I'm damn sure today's pollies would impress voters a lot more by showing some guts. And Keating also talked about the need to get policy and rhetoric lined up. What was required, he said, was, quote, "long, straight lines of rhetoric that stay straight for years at a time." Isn't that a wonderful way of putting it? And he complained that Bob Hawke kept bending the lines and he had to keep straightening them. Well, I don't think Malcolm Turnbull and company would recognise a straight line of rhetoric if they fell over it. And finally, even the vivid language Keating used as he spoke to me, and I don't mean the C words and F words, were a reminder of the shortcomings of today's political practitioners. there was a description of the recession John Howard had presided over. Keating wanted to contrast it with his recession. And he said of Howard, he had a neutron bomb go off. A neutron bomb kills everything that's living, leaves the buildings intact but kills everything inside. That's what Howard did. And Keating said this, I pulled the levers in taking the place into recession, and I can pull another lever and take it out. When Howard pulled the levers, it was like Laurel and Hardy in a motor car. He pulled the bloody handbrake and it came off in his hand. He pulled the fucking steering wheel and it came off in his hand. Well, it's accessible, it's colourful, it's memorable, it gets your attention, and compare it with the scripted talking points that current politicians learn by rote and spew out on demand. Keating was right, by the way, and he did handle the recession thing in the right way. I think it's pretty obvious to me now that that caution and equivocation would not have cut the mustard. They managed to win an election after that recession. So, like Martin Luther King, I have a dream, an educational facility to teach today's politicians the skills of the trade with Professor Keating in charge, and a row of desks at the front for Malcolm Turnbull and his cabinet. Now I'd better shut up and let you ask some questions.
Paul Malone, Laurie. I'm interested in the story you just told because there's another version of that event, and it came from John Button, who told me that Keating made that statement after he and Button and Hawke had met in their pre-question time briefing, which they did every question time. And Button had been arguing for a long time that we had been in recession. He had said that he'd been telling Keating had been denying it. And Button said at that meeting, I am going to go out in the Senate and say we are in recession. I don't care what you're going to say. Keating stormed out into the press conference and said, this is the recession we had to have. That's the background to that story. I wonder if you'd like to comment.
Oh, Paul didn't tell me that version, but he did say at one point in the conversation, John Button, what would he know? There was a lot of rivalry between those two, and they detested each other. I remember John Button used to poke fun at Paul Keating's J-curve. So I don't know if that story is true. I hadn't heard it. I wish I'd cracked it at the time if it was true.
You've covered 13 Prime Ministers. Are you prepared to rate the best and the worst, as you
Prime
saw
Ministers?
it? Yep.
Well, there's no contest for worst. I mean, Billy McMahon, and there'd be about 300 miles between him and the next person. There are no redeeming features about Billy. The others are good in different ways. I mean, Gough Whitlam, he sort of blew it in office in lots of ways. Destroyed all his goodwill with a lot of help from his cabinet in 3 years, but he transformed the country. No other Prime Minister's done anything like that, I think, probably since maybe Deakin even. Hawke and Keating between them, did great things. I mean, the way they managed to get the Labor Party to do, agree to things like privatisation, free markets, it was an astonishing feat of political skill, which is what Keating and Hawke were both very good at. And John Howard, you don't sneeze at John Howard either. He made every mistake in the book in his opposition days, learned from them all, and as past Prime Minister, he showed guts, particularly over the gun buyback. When the government was in deep doo-doo, the way he escaped was worthy of Houdini. He was pretty good in his own way.
Do you briefly want to elaborate why Billy McMahon was the worst in your view?
Oh, look, Billy was a liar. He was a thief. He was a traitor to his colleagues. He was an unpleasant little bastard. And he blamed everybody else. I remember when David Solomon and I wrote a book about the election, the making of an Australian Prime Minister. We interviewed Billy extensively, and we had in there a story about Paul. I think it was Paul Hasluck allegedly chairing some committee and it failed to do its job. And after the book appeared, this turned out to be totally wrong. Billy McMahon was supposed to be in charge. We had to stick a correction into copies of the book. Billy McMahon had absolutely nothing going for him.
Thank you. Yes, Mark Phillips, down the back.
Mark Phillips from the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance. Laurie, you sort of alluded to this in your speech, but there's a tension currently between the role of journalism in holding powerful people to account and the constant cries of fake news from politicians in particular. I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts about how we combat that, what your thoughts are about sort of the future of journalism in that kind of environment.
Well, one of the ways we combat it is to stop following social media and doing things like we did with that Turnbull photograph. I mean, that just plays into the hands of people who accuse us of fake news. And I was astonished by the reputable areas of the media that fell for that. It's very depressing. Look, the media is not trusted, which is why politicians can do that. And part of the reason we're not trusted is our own fault. You know, we do have to, I think, pay more attention to being right and being responsible. You know, now that everybody's a publisher if they want to be, you know, the mainstream media has to lift its game. It has to be different. It has to be better. And that's all we can do, just try and improve what we do.
Yes, Hugh.
Hi, Laurie. Hugh Nayland from Channel 9. Recently,
this will
be a tough one, yeah. Dorothy Dixon for you. Now, recently, after the Midwinter Ball in Canberra, you reported on Malcolm Turnbull mocking Donald Trump. Two questions on that. First, the decision to go with it when theoretically or nominally the event was off the record. And the second question relates to the fact that you broke it online at 3:30 in the afternoon and it went very well, but the decision to go online as opposed to holding it to 6 o'clock, which traditionally we would have done.
Right, well, yeah, I did ignore the off-the-record rules. I mean, I wasn't there and I didn't regard myself as bound by them, but I think it's appalling anyway that journalists who are supposed to try and find out things and report stuff not cooperate in keeping things hidden and confidential. What we're about is opposing secrecy, and for a group of journalists, particularly in Canberra, to adopt that approach themselves, I think it's just disgusting. And I've always had that view. I used to be, many years ago, the vice president of the press gallery, and David Solomon at the time was the president of the press gallery, and when we wrote that book about Whitlam in 1972, Gough took great delight in referring to me as the second most important member of the press gallery. David was the first and most important. But I resigned that post over two things. The annual press gallery dinner, they wouldn't allow partners, so I thought that was ridiculous. But they also insisted on secrecy. And when I resigned then, I said every opportunity I'd report it. I've always held that attitude. Everybody knew I had that attitude. Not only journalists, but politicians know that. It's a phony thing anyway. The Placido Domingo speech leaked, and I'm sure Keating didn't mind it being leaked. There was a fair bit of assistance given to the leaking of Placido Domingo. Why did I run with the mocking of Trump online? Because it was a kind of different sort of story. I'd got interested anyway in the growing importance of online journalism, and I think some stories are particularly suited to it, and I thought that might be one. So I treated it in a more casual way than I would a resignation of a prime minister or something like that. And it worked, I think. I was a bit surprised when Nine then asked me to do it in a different way for the 6 o'clock news, but it worked too. But I just thought it was the kind of story, and it's not an earth-shattering story, it's a funny story. So I thought it suited online. I might point out, by the way, that I think that's probably the best thing that's happened to Malcolm Turnbull for a while. I mean, it was very popular, and people liked it. They saw a bit of Malcolm as Malcolm is.
What did you make of the impersonation, though?
Sorry?
What did you make of the impersonation?
Well, he's good at it.
Yeah. Yes, Nick.
Nicholas Rees from the University of Melbourne. I should also disclose that I did a tour of duty in Julia Gillard's office in a very, very short spell with Kevin Rudd. I want to ask a question about the calibre of today's politicians and your analysis about how good they were in the good old days and how poor they seem to be today.
The good old days lasted a long while and they weren't that long ago. I think it's only in recent years that we've had the deterioration.
Yeah, so look, I genuinely don't know the answer to this question, but do you really think that the calibre of politicians in previous era were better than they are today, or has something bigger happened? Has the system changed in some way? Because there'd be few walks of life, I think, where you'd say, back in the old days, they were actually more talented and better. There's normally something else going on.
Well, I think there's a lot going on. Back in the old days, politicians did learn the art. As Keating said to me in that phone conversation, he started learning the art of political judgment when he attended his first ALP branch meeting at the age of 15. And it took him 20 years to get on top of it. And politicians in those days used to do that. I mean, I first saw Fred Daly speaking on the back of a truck in Newtown. Just one weekend. It wasn't an election. He was out there and he was matching wits with interjectors and he was, engaging the crowd by being humorous. And Fred had learned the art of persuasion by doing that, and so did a lot of politicians in those days. Gough Whitlam used to talk in the back of a truck. He used to also tramp through the sort of muddy streets of Sutherland and chop wood for people that he wanted to vote for him. Politicians did get trained in that way in those days, I think. And they don't seem to anymore. I mean, they sort of get into the game without knowing much about it except the sort of back office bureaucratic skills. And that's not enough. That's not how you persuade the punters. Also, the forces today are designed really to intimidate politicians. I mean, they got all this focus group stuff that tells them what not to do and what not to say, and caution is the byword. Well, you don't get anywhere with caution, and Keating knew that. You've got to lead, you've got to take a stand, you've got to fight for what you want to do, otherwise you don't get anything done. And that's probably the biggest problem. The politicians became scared. I think polling and focus groups are part of the reason for that, a large part.
There's a question over here, yes.
Hi Laurie, it's Kerry O'Shea, Sun News Pick. My question is about leaks. How hard is it now to protect your sources in this era of data protection?
Well, it's getting a lot harder. I mean, you can't really phone people anymore. I mean, your phone leaves an extraordinary track of who you've talked to and where you've been. And in America, the authorities are quite open now. They don't need to subpoena journalists and demand to know their source. They just get their phone records, and that is finding sources. It's frightening sources. It's happening here as well. I think we're headed back to the Watergate days where you need to move a pot plant on your balcony to tell someone you want to talk to them. But meeting them in a parking garage wouldn't work because you'd be picked up by CCTV.
Question at the back.
Laurie,
Jeff Wilco, yeah.
Jeff Wilkinson, late of the Sun News Pictorial, very late. Just for the record, could we establish from you your PB for a long lunch in your prime? Because I have a very strong recollection of a day in the mid-70s when I staggered back into the office at about 1:30 a.m. after a particularly long lunch, which was full of joie de journalism and other things.
It wasn't just lunch, though. We went from lunch to dinner.
That's right. Well, that's what the night Chief of Staff Secretary pointed out to me. She said, I suppose you think you're pretty clever, but you're still 4 hours behind Laurie's long lunch record. So is there an established figure?
Look, I think my record was something like 13 and a half hours.
Good work.
But that was a long, long time ago.
Is the industry poorer, do you think, that journalists don't have
long lunches anymore?
Yeah.
Probably, yeah.
And all of us, that we just don't have the time to do that sort of thing anymore?
Well, I think it's poorer for it, because aside from anything else, I mean, politicians used to take part, bureaucrats used to take part. And we laugh about the long lunches, but I got good stories over long lunches, made good contacts over long lunches, and I think we are the poorer for the fact that it doesn't happen. You couldn't have those lunches anymore anyway because technology has brought deadlines forward so that your morning newspapers have to have everything in by about 6 o'clock. Television has probably got later deadlines than newspapers.
Yeah. Such a shame. Yes.
At the Walkleys a few years ago, you courageously praised the work of Julian Assange. Have the intervening years done anything to revise your view of Assange?
Well, not of what they did then. I still think that was, it was an act of journalism that changed the rules of the game, and I think it was legitimate. But the more recent stuff, if they were, the alleged relationship with the Russians, that's, if that's true, that's obviously not what journalism should be about.
Yep.
And then some of his comments, of course, I find pretty unsavoury. But the Walkley Award wasn't for Assange; it was to WikiLeaks as an organisation.
Yes.
It wasn't to the man. So I think it still stands. I think it was the right award.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question. Broading.
Laurie, just back on sources, and everyone knows your legendary commitment to protecting sources, and not just you, but significant journalists have affected the course of Australian history. Do you think there's any case for a cabinet-style archiving of sources to be released in 50 years or something like that? Because I often think that as much as what they leaked, but who they leaked, has been significant in Australian political history, isn't it?
Yeah. Look, I don't think it would serve any purpose. I think 50 years later you wouldn't gain anything from it. And one of the problems would be that I think sometimes the revelations would be so mundane that it would destroy the romance of the original story. I think the mystery is part of what matters. It makes it more fun anyway.
Question here, Pat.
Yep. Laurie, hi. Patrick O'Byrne from 6 O'Clock Advisory and Press Club Board. We can't let an editorial media doyen go without asking his opinion on Australian media reform. The passing laws, are they good or bad for the industry, and indeed do they help or hinder readers, viewers and listeners?
Well, because I've retired, I didn't take much notice of what was passed yesterday. So I can't really answer the question. Obviously, media reform is necessary. The whole digital thing has changed the game so much that the old regulation system was just stupid and laughable. So reform was necessary. Whether they've done it well or not, I don't know. But what did strike me was the easy way the government seemed to sort of talk about trading off things to do with the ABC. I think that should be alarming. And I could quote the Prime Minister. He gave a speech a few years ago on how the media would survive the digital disruption. And Turnbull himself talked about the importance of the ABC. At least we've got that. That must be protected. Well, he needs to be reminded of that, I think.
Yes, question over here.
Hi, Michaela from 3AW. I just wanted to know who you found to be the most intimidating person you ever interviewed.
Keating, if you didn't know what you were talking about. Paul did know what he was talking about. A hawkie would try and bully you. Bullying and bluster. But Keating was one who could carve you up if you weren't on top of your subject.
Yes, over here.
Hi, Caitlin Offer, AAP. I was just going to ask back to the midwinter ball story. While it exploded, it did also die down, and there wasn't much for but there was personal attacks against you. But we've also seen a lot of other journalists or commentators who pop their head out get beaten down quite significantly. Do you think that if that story had come from a younger journalist or someone not of your stature, that the reaction would have been the same?
Oh, I think it would have been pretty vicious. Yeah, I'm sure people would have come down on that journalist like a ton of bricks. Yeah, I mean, but I think I hope the battle's won. I don't think we'll have any more off the record press gallery balls, and I think they'll be better for it, by the way. And I think the speeches will be better. Bill Shorten didn't put any effort into this year's speech. It was pathetic. I bet he gives a better one next year when the cameras are on him.
Yes, sir.
Laurie, to get more stability and less shouting in our parliaments, should we have more women there?
Well, women can be pretty shouty and abusive as well. I'm not sure that Michaelia Cash would come second in too many shouty matches, really. Jackie Lambie's not bad. Look, I don't mind the shouty stuff so much. What I mind is the content. I mean, it's just people insulting each other. The old days where wit was used in Parliament have gone. I mean, why can't people be witty instead of just nasty and horrible? I don't care what the volume's like, but be funny, be clever, be witty, and you just don't see it anymore. I don't understand why, but the wit has just gone.
Can you see the prospect of that changing, looking at the front and back benches of both sides of politics? Any towering figures?
Well, I'd like to see Peter Dutton being witty, but it's something I haven't witnessed yet.
Mr. Michael Gordon.
Laurie, I'd be interested in what scoop gave you the biggest buzz and why.
It was the Gare affair, the story of how Gough Whitlam had decided to appoint Vince Gare, the leader of the DLP, former leader of the DLP, to a diplomatic post, so that there'd be an extra Senate vacancy in Queensland which Labor could possibly win and give them control of the Senate. I mean, the reason that gave me a buzz was because it wasn't actually a leak. My colleague John Lombard had heard that there was a diplomatic appointment in the mail, which was interesting. That's all we knew. So I hit the phone, and everyone I spoke to backed off, wouldn't talk about it. And one made the mistake of saying, I can't talk to you, it's big, big, big. Well, it's a challenge. And so I just paced up and down for hours trying to work out what could be that big, what diplomatic appointment could be that big. And I thought about the Senate, and I sort of put a hypothesis together in my mind, and then rang one of the people that I was speaking to before and said, when will Gare be taking up the post? How did you find out about that? Was the response, and that's how I got that story. Now, that gave me a buzz because it was an intellectual exercise, and there was a bit of sneakiness involved too, which was good. But the budget story, for example, it was just handed to me. That wasn't the main challenge. There was trying to gather it all into a tape recorder in the time I had, but there was no challenge in actually getting it. But when you've got to actually work at something and work something out, the other one was the Iraqi money affair, where Gough Whitlam and David Coombe and others we tried to get $500,000 from the Iraq Ba'ath Party for the 75 election, and I didn't get a leak on that. I was ringing Jeff Cole, the New South Wales Labor Secretary, and I mentioned David Coombe, and the response I got was cold, and I knew they'd been best mates. So I set out to find out why there'd been a falling out, and it was over that money. So when you've got to work it out, it's more satisfying, I think.
Yes.
Just on the Gare issue, I believed it was true and I've told the story 1,000 times, but is it the case that you actually rang the Gare house and Mrs. Gare answered the phone and you said congratulations and she fell right in?
That's right. I said I'm really to congratulate the Senator on the appointment, and she said, oh, he will be pleased. Yeah, but I had already confirmed it with other sources before that.
Hook, line and sinker. Jim, yes.
Yeah, Jim Middleton, Sky News. Yes, I think the Gare affair was an extraordinary intellectual accomplishment, and I think you're right. In terms of all the journalistic challenges you laid down to people like me over the years, that's the one that I think really does stand out. And thanks also, Laurie, for all the fun over the years as well. You and I are among that select band who've had the luxury of working both in the old house and in the new house.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think about the consequences for Australian democracy of the shift, given that we've moved from what was a pretty intimate discussion chamber to a basketball court more akin to a Bruce Springsteen concert, and also the effect in terms of the political discourse of having a pretty small venue again, where ministers, members from both sides of the aisle were higgledy-piggledy within that pretty small building. Do you think that really has had a consequence? Because it's also the case that the three people that you point out as acmes of political leadership, Keating, Howard and Whitlam, all operated, at least in the earlier part of their career, in the old house.
Yeah, look, I think that was very important, the change to the new building. Apart from anything else, it separated the politicians from the people. You know, this new house was supposed to be democratic, and we could tramp over the lawns and walk over our politicians. What it actually did was cut people off from the pollies, because in the old house they couldn't get away from them. Everyone had to go into King's Hall, you know, tourists, punters, ministers, bureaucrats, and so there was that constant contact, and people could buttonhole politicians. So I think cutting politicians off from the people was a mistake in the new building, but cutting politicians off from each other too. I mean, even the simple thing like, you know, basically in the old building, everyone met in the urinal. You know, there weren't many women there, but when there were, Gay Davidson used to meet you in the urinal as well when she was running the Canberra Times office. That kind of thing doesn't happen in the new building. All those sort of communal things, the sort of meetings, the chance meetings that used to happen in the old building, are much rarer in the sort of sterilised, compartmentalised new Parliament House. And I mean, even keeping the cabinet room the way that's shut off, I mean, I think that affects the atmosphere of cabinet. I mean, they don't get any light in there. It's like being in jail. I think the new building, I don't like the look of it anyway. I don't like the great praying mantis on the roof. But I've never liked the building. I thought it was an anti-democratic building, and I'd love to go back to the old one. I'd come out of retirement if they went back to the old one. Look, in the old one, if someone was planning a rebellion against the leadership, I mean, you could pick it up from the vibrations in the walls.
Hi, Laurie, Siobhan Koopmans from 6 O'Clock Advisory. Just a very quick question. What's your thoughts on journos becoming politicians, and might you follow in the footsteps of Darren Hinch?
No.
Gee, why not?
Yeah, well, Alfred Deakin was the first one. I've just been reading the new biography of Deakin. I'd forgotten about how he actually not only wrote for one British newspaper when he was Australian Prime Minister, he wrote for two, and he used to argue with himself and also criticise himself. So, you know, I think that was pretty good. Look, there have been some important journalists who became politicians. I mean, John Curtin, I think. I'm not sure I'd really call Malcolm Turnbull a journalist, but I think I've told the story before. Malcolm was state roundsman in New South Wales for 9 when he was also a university student, but he thought he was pretty good at it, and he went to Sam Chisholm, who ran the network, and said, you know, Sam, what do you think of a new program called Turnbull at 10? And Sam said, oh, it's a good idea. Do you think 10 would be interested?
Just a quick question, if I may.
Yes, the last one over there.
Jenny from the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance. Just interested in, have you got a favourite cartoonist, is somebody who's drawn a political, image of somebody? And if so, what image sticks in your mind?
Well, my favourite political cartoonist was Patrick Cook. He used to illustrate my columns in the old Bulletin. And my favourite one was one that wasn't published on grounds of taste, but I've still got it on my wall. It was when I wrote a story about Paul Keating again, who'd, as I say, he didn't like journalists who criticised him, so he was going around describing Laura Tingle as the fat-assed bitch and Nikki Savva as the Tory bitch. So I wrote this in a column, and Patrick illustrated with this wonderful cartoon of Paul Keating as a sign writer, writing on a door, office of the status of fat-assed bitches. And then Keating had this wonderful low-slung shorts and the biggest bum crack you've ever seen. It was a wonderful cartoon. Patrick Cook was a great loss, I think, to cartoon.
As Laurie Oakes is to political journalism as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, please thank Laurie Oakes for a fantastic speech.
Thanks very much.
And a couple of special presentations made to you, and that wasn't a Dorothy Dixer because we know you've made it in Canberra, but you haven't really made it in Melbourne until you've been caricatured by the fantastic Mark Knight, cartoonist at the Herald Sun. And on behalf of the Press Club, Mark has put together this fantastic cartoon of you, straddling the old Herald Sun building on Flinders Street.
That's great. Thank you, that's great. Thanks to Mark.
I'll just hold that, and there's one more. The thing about Laurie is, beyond and above his journalistic exploits, that he's always given back to the profession. And speaking as president of the Press Club, I know that Laurie has put in, he's come down to give speeches, he's volunteered in many other ways, so he has been a fantastic example of giving back to the profession. And in 1997, along with the equally fantastic Michelle Grattan, Laurie was made a Lifetime Achiever of the Press Club. He's won various other awards, many other awards along the way, but we thought, just as a small token of our appreciation, we have decided at the Press Club board to award you lifetime membership of the Melbourne Press Club.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Which means that you'll have to come back and give more speeches.
I'd love to, and thank you very much. This is really great. Thank you.
Just one last question. So how are you going to spend retired life?
We'll probably come into the Melbourne Press Club. Look, I'm not sure. I'll find something non-journalistic and non-political to volunteer for, I think.
Thanks again, Laurie. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.